Thank you very much, Spencer, and thank you for the opportunity to talk. So I'm going to talk to you, and I won't start off with acronym soup because Spencer's done a beautiful job of explaining APDS and TROD. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the context is really, if you look broadly, we're going digital. I think everybody knows we're going digital. And that applies as much to transport. And if you look into things that facilitate people being able to understand where they can use the curbside, where they can park, what they can do on the roads, and ultimately the evolution of how we control automated vehicles, you see strategy documents like the urban strategy from DFT. And that really underpins a set of activities that I'm going to briefly explain to you. I'm going to talk to you about two things. So one is work ongoing concerning the digitization of traffic regulation orders. And then secondly, some interesting development work that's going on for parking data through an organization called the Alliance for Parking Data Standards. Next slide, please. So first, traffic regulation orders. The landscape broadly is that it's not particularly coherent, it's not particularly digital for a lot of authorities, and trying to streamline that and bring it into a more digital age is certainly one of the drivers that DFT has. Next slide, please. Very dense, and I apologize, but I thought I'd give you a chronology, and there are actually hyperlinks, so if these slides are shared you can go off and find yourself these documents. But a series of projects undertaken by DFT, both on technical and policy, looking at the barriers to and the opportunities that exist for digitizing traffic regulation orders as we move forward. The most recent project listed at the bottom is a technical alpha, and that really comes up with a perspective on how this could look like as a national service. Can you just press one more, please? Then what comes next? So we're just about to move into a phase where there's going to be further validation of that candidate data model and some targeted use across some authorities. The expectation is that later this year there will also be a policy consultation, and probably in 2022 a technical beta which is really preparing the landscape for deploying a national service. Next slide, please. Just touching briefly, one more press. Touching briefly on the outputs of the most recent project, the Alpha. So what we have is an improving candidate model. So this is really how you would encode the data to be shared commonly. A set of service definitions and technical architecture recommendations that have been made to DFT, and it's important to note on that it doesn't assume a DFT centralized system. It's very much building on the existing market suppliers and what they can do, but trying to bring the resultant data together into a more coherent form, absolutely in a more standardized form. And there's a very strong business justification that comes with that, particularly with the value that's shown to local authorities in terms of efficiency, process cost savings, the ability to share your information much more broadly in a standardized way. And because it will be available in a standardized digital way, that then becomes of much greater interest to the data aggregators, the Googles of this world, the TomToms and Heres of this world, who want to use that data to inform and drive their services. And ultimately, what that should mean is that you end up with better information flowing outwards, greater compliance, and that should make the use of orders more effective. It's also preparing the ground for what happens when automated vehicles do start to come live onto the network and how they understand the network and how they're controlled. And so having that information in a digitally consumable, machine processable, machine understandable form is pretty critical to that picture. Next slide, please. So I'll just now attempt to segue across into the parking stuff. So next press, please. So obviously the work on traffic regulation orders is being led by and funded through DFT, various projects, and that's really looking at how that data, the traffic regulation order data, can be put into a meaningful form and shared on a national basis. And we believe that creates great opportunities, but of course it also does tie across, because most on-street parking is controlled by traffic regulation orders, so it also provides a fantastic resource to feed into what we do with parking data and parking services. Next button press, please. So I'll take you off into another world, but it's very strongly linked. Next slide, please. So my colleagues from the Alliance for Parking Data Standards, who I'll describe in a moment, describe the parking ecosystem world as getting increasingly complex. I'm just about old enough to remember driving up to a multi-story car park and there being a little guy in a booth who would open the barrier for me, and when I came to come out, I'd hand him cash because that's the only thing they would possibly accept, and if he wasn't there, you couldn't get out. And that world is completely revolutionized, and we have a much more diverse set of players in this marketplace. Data aggregators, service providers, payment service providers, and of course the local authorities as part of that mix, both as from a policy level, but also as one of the key parking operators. Next slide, please. What became evident about 3 years ago was that a set of large stakeholder parking sector interest groups, BPA most notably at the top, but also EPA, the European Parking Association, and IPMI, which is the North American counterpart, realized that they were all working on this problem independently, separately, but at the same time. And they came together and they formed a non-for-profit organization called the Alliance for Parking Data Standards, with the express aim to produce for the sector as a whole, globally, data standards that will be useful to the parking sector. And that's been progressing over time. It's important to note the initial funder, top right corner. So there was some seed corn funding put in by DFT that was extremely useful in getting this moving. The organization now is growing. It has a lot of support from major parking operators. You can see across the middle here. And the standards and specifications that are being produced have been widely distributed and widely consulted, pulling in a lot of expertise from different parties. And what's interesting is you'll start to see that these are not just something which is coming from the parking operators, that they are actually starting to be adopted more broadly and coming into more formally recognized standards, which will be of interest in terms of public procurement. Next slide, please. At a very simplistic level, the APDS core data model describes a set of domains, which to most people in the parking sector will make some sense. So we describe pretty much everything centered around the object in the middle, which is place. Whether that's on street or off street, we've got a model for how you go about describing that. And then that links across to rights and how those rights relate to rates, how I can ask for quotations for using a particular right in a particular place at a particular time, observations, and demand in terms of supply and demand in terms of occupancy. So there's a growing model. People often say, well, what about enforcement? And what about the linkage across the financial transactions? And the APDS organization and specifications continue to develop. So they're still working, they're still improving. Next slide, please. I made mention that these started off as I suppose, primarily what people would describe as parking industry standards, but are spreading more broadly, and it's very true. So they've been taken forward now as a set of specifications to ISO, the International Standards Organization. Most of us are familiar with standards like ISO 9000, but ISO produce a lot of other standards. And the APDS parking data specifications are the basis of the emerging standard for parking data coming from ISO. In the middle part of this year, that should reach some strong stability, and then 2022 it will be published. At the same time, there was a very interesting strategic decision at a European level, which is traffic practitioners might have heard of the acronym DATEX2, centre right, which is a set of traffic management protocols. And they have a parking publication which has been around since originally 2013, 2015. And they decided to actually throw away their specification and pick up the APDS specifications. And so that work is also ongoing. So APDS becomes the basis under the DATEX specifications. The relevance of that, perhaps not so strongly relevant in Brexit Britain, but in Europe, a lot of delegated regulations and obligations on member states ask for DATEX form data. So parking data will across Europe be in that form. So as I say at the bottom, the APDS specification is emerging as a global reference standard for parking data. Next slide, please. Of particular interest to DFT, there's been pilot work ongoing for a little while now through Manchester City Council, but it's not just Manchester, it also spreads across to Liverpool and Salford, to establish a pilot of a publicly owned platform for parking data. And the picture here describes that. And it's interesting because it's evolving over time. And multi-vendor payment is one of the interesting features that's coming in the current phase 2. But DFT recently launched a tender for a discovery and alpha project, which is just started. And that is looking at taking this concept and taking it forward as a national parking platform. And I guess speaking to the authority people in the room, well, okay, so that's all very interesting on behalf of DFT. Why would it be of interest to me as a local authority? And it's pretty clear. If you talk to people from Manchester, they're pretty clear about where they see the benefits lying. It's really providing much greater visibility in terms of the parking data. It also aggregates data together, so it becomes of much greater interest to the service providers who are consuming that data and then providing it onto the public. And it also is likely to lead towards more standardized routes of procurement and terms and conditions for the supply and use of data. And of course, going back to the first part of the presentation, it links rather neatly across to digitizing traffic regulation data for on-street parking and how that fits into the overall picture. So certainly Manchester will argue they're very strongly in favour of doing this, and they believe you will be as well when you become familiar with it. On behalf of Graham, he would say, I'm sure that he's more than willing to take feeds into the current discovery project from anybody who's got strong views. I won't say quite how to do that because he might be able to inform, but that's ongoing and is a great deal of interest. Next slide, please. So just tidying back up again, trying to link these two things back together. So we see DFT's interesting influence in both, but both are believed to be of strong interest to local authorities. I'll take a very positive note. I believe, spending a lot of my time doing stuff internationally, these are initiatives which make the UK market leading or moving us into a position where we could be, and certainly would recommend that people pay some attention to this and try to find out more and get involved. Last slide, please. On the formal level, of course, from a DFT perspective, they see this as really a key pillar, the development and drawing together of this data as a key pillar towards future mobility and data to support future mobility. And so it's very enjoyable and interesting to be involved in these initiatives, and I genuinely see them being a step forward for the future. Thank you very much.